Welcome to Wild Cowboy Tales, the only fire you'll find that's big enough to cast a light on all the dark legends of the American West. We tell the stories of gold, of greed, and of the graves men dig for themselves in the unforgiving dust. Before we ride into the heart of the great American desert with tonight's tale, do us a kindness and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never be left behind on the trail. Now, check your canteen, because it's a long dry ride, and listen to the story of the Blackwater Five, of the gold they stole, and of the desert that became their final, silent partner. The gold was not just a prize, it was a sun. A heavy, yellow, and dangerously hot sun, crammed into 5 sweat-stained leather saddlebags. It was the culmination of a month of meticulous planning, a night of sheer, audacious violence, and a lifetime of petty cruelties that had finally led to one magnificent, defining score. The Blackwater Five, as they called themselves, had just robbed the main federal assay office in San Francisco, and they had done the impossible. They had gotten away clean. As they rode east, putting the foggy, gaslight streets of the city behind them and heading for the vast, open anonymity of the desert, a feeling of giddy, godlike invincibility settled over them. They were no longer just a collection of hard-bitten outlaws. They were kings, their saddles heavy with the weight of their new kingdom. The bargain had been simple, sworn over a bottle of cheap whiskey in a filthy back-alley saloon. 5 men, 5 equal shares. A brotherhood forged in risk and bound by the promise of a wealth beyond their wildest dreams. At their head was Silas Thorne, the architect of the heist. He was not the strongest or the fastest of the group, but he was the smartest. A former card sharp with a mind that worked like a well-oiled machine, he saw the world as a series of probabilities and percentages. He was the brain, and he believed, with a cold, absolute certainty, that he was in control. His right-hand man was Gideon, a hulking, bearded giant of a man, a former bare-knuckle boxer whose only argument was the crushing power of his fists. He was the muscle, the blunt instrument of the group, and his loyalty to Silas was as simple and as solid as a block of granite. Then there was Dutch, a weary, nervous man with a constant, twitching energy and eyes that never seemed to settle. He was their explosives expert, a man who spoke the language of black powder and nitroglycerin better than he spoke English. His loyalty was not to any man, but to the thrill of the explosion, the beautiful, chaotic dance of destruction. The fourth was a young, handsome gunslinger who called himself Sundance. He was all swagger and charm, his movements fluid and graceful, his hand a blur when it went for the ivory grip Colt on his hip. He was in it for the glory, for the legend he was building, the gold simply a way of keeping score. And the fifth, the quietest and perhaps the most dangerous of them all, was a man known only as Kane. He was a tracker, a ghost, a man of few words and an unnerving, watchful stillness. He had joined the group late, his skill at navigating the treacherous desert trails the final, necessary piece of Silas's plan. He spoke little, and no one knew his past, but there was a cold, predatory light in his eyes that even the other hardened men found unsettling. As they made their first camp in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, the city a distant memory, the mood was one of boisterous celebration. They passed a bottle, their laughter echoing in the cool night air. They were brothers, partners, champions who had faced the dragon and stolen its hoard. To us, Sundance had toasted, his voice full of a youthful, arrogant triumph. The Blackwater Five, the richest sons of bitches in California. They had all cheered, their voices a chorus of greed and camaraderie. They believed in the bargain. They believed in the equal shares. But as Silas Thorne watched his men, a cold, calculating thought, as quiet and as deadly as a snake in the grass, uncoiled in the back of his mind. 5 shares. It was a good number, but 4 was better. And 3. 3 was better still. 1. 1 was a perfect number. He pushed the thought down. It was too soon. The desert was long, and they still needed each other. But the seed, the insidious, golden seed of betrayal, had been planted. And in the hard, barren ground of the outlaw's heart, such seeds grow fast. They were a brotherhood, for now. But the sun they were carrying in their saddlebags was already beginning to burn, and it would not be long before they all felt the heat. The first 3 days of their journey were a sun-drenched, dust-choked trial by fire, a harsh introduction to the unforgiving reality of the Great Mojave Desert. The celebratory mood of the first night quickly evaporated, boiled away by the relentless, shimmering heat. The landscape was a monotonous, alien world of sand, rock, and skeletal Joshua trees that seemed to claw at the metallic blue sky. The camaraderie of the campfire was replaced by the irritable, sweat-soaked silence of the trail. The gold was no longer a symbol of their triumph, it was a burden. Its physical weight was immense, slowing the horses, straining the saddle leather, a constant, heavy reminder of the prize they had yet to secure. But its psychological weight was even greater. It was a silent, sixth member of their party, a presence that began to warp the very air between them. The first crack in their fragile brotherhood appeared, as it so often does, over something small and insignificant. It was a dispute over water. By the end of the third day, their canteens were running low. Cain, the tracker, who had promised them a reliable spring, had led them to a dry, cracked patch of earth, the wellhead choked with sand. "You said it would be here, Dutch," the explosives man said, his voice a ragged, accusatory whine. He kicked at the dry ground, his nervous energy amplified by the heat and the thirst. "The land changes," Cain replied, his voice a low, unbothered rumble. He showed no emotion, no apology. He simply scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed against the glare. "Changes," Sundance scoffed, his handsome face flushed and ugly with frustration. "We're dying of thirst out here, and the land changes. We're paying you to know this dessert, not to guess." "My price does not include making it rain," Cain said, his gaze settling on Sundance for a moment, a look of such cold, flat disinterest that it was more insulting than any direct threat. Silas Thorne, the leader, stepped in, his role to be the calm, rational center. "Easy now," he said, his voice smooth and placating. "We have enough to last until morning. Cain will find us water. He always does." But it was Gideon, the giant, who escalated the situation. His loyalty to Silas made him see the questioning of Cain as a challenge to his leader's authority. He stomped over to Sundance, his massive frame blocking out the sun. "The boss said be easy," Gideon growled, his voice a low threat. "You got a problem with that?" Sundance, whose pride was as finely tuned and as quick to fire as his ivory-gripped Colt, bristled. He was not a man to be intimidated by brute force. "My problem is with dying of thirst because our tracker is leading us in circles," he snapped back, his hand drifting casually, almost unconsciously, towards the butt of his gun. The air in the small, dusty camp crackled with a sudden, deadly tension. For a moment, it seemed that the first shots of their internal war would be fired not over a bar of gold, but over a mouthful of water. It was Cain who broke the standoff. "There," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the tension. He pointed to a low, distant line of mesas, their tops hazy in the evening light. "There are tanks in those rocks. Runoff from the last rain. We can reach it in 2 hours if we push." Silas seized the opportunity to reassert control. "You hear that? 2 hours. Let's move. We're wasting daylight." The crisis was averted, but the damage was done. The first crack had appeared. The unspoken thought, the seed of suspicion, was now planted in all their minds. Cain, the quiet one, the man they all depended on for their survival in this desolate land. What if he wasn't as reliable as they thought? What if he made a mistake? Or what if it wasn't a mistake at all? That night, as they made camp in the cool shadows of the mesas, the life-giving water gurgling nearby, the mood was sullen and divided. The easy sharing of the bottle was gone. The men sat apart, each lost in his own thoughts. Silas watched them, his mind a cold, calculating machine. He had seen the fault lines. Sundance's vanity, Dutch's instability, Gideon's blind loyalty, which could be a strength but also a liability, and Cain's unnerving, solitary self-possession. He lay in his bedroll, the heavy saddlebags of gold a lumpy pillow beneath his head, and he thought about the math again, the problem of dividing 5 into 1. And he realized, with a new, chilling clarity, that the desert itself might be the solution. It was a place of attrition, a place where mistakes were fatal. And a clever man, a man who understood the percentages, could help those mistakes along. The bargain was still in place, but the brotherhood was already bleeding out into the sand. The incident at the dry well had changed the chemical composition of the group. The air of invincibility was gone, replaced by a low-grade, simmering paranoia. Every man now watched the others from the corner of his eye. The gold, which they had once dreamed of spending, now became a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. Silas Thorne, a master manipulator, decided to use this new atmosphere to his advantage. He saw the cracks and understood that a little pressure, applied in the right place, could turn a crack into a chasm. His first target was the most obvious, the one who was not truly part of their fraternity of violence, Cain, the tracker. Cain was an outsider, a contractor hired for a specific skill. He was not bound to them by a shared history of crime, only by a promise of a share. And in Silas's cold, pragmatic mind, that made him the most expendable. Getting rid of Cain would not only increase the shares for the rest of them, but it would also remove the one man whose skills and unnerving silence made Silas feel like he wasn't completely in control. The plan he devised was one of subtle, cruel simplicity. He would not challenge Cain directly. He would turn the others against him. He would use the desert as his accomplice. They had been on the trail for another 2 days, the landscape growing more brutal, more desolate. On the third morning, Silas called a private meeting with Gideon, Sundance, and Dutch, while Cain was out scouting the trail ahead. "I'm worried about our friend," Silas began, his voice a mask of feigned concern. "He seems distracted. The dry wall was one thing, but yesterday, he led us on a 5-mile detour on a canyon he said was impassable. I remember the maps. There was a clear trail through it. He's holding out on us," Dutch whined, his nervous energy latching onto the new target. "He's taking the long way round, saving the good water holes for himself. Or maybe," Sundance added, his voice a low, suspicious drawl, "he's not leading us to safety at all. Maybe he's leading us into a trap. Maybe he's got friends out here, and he's planning on taking it all." The poison was working. The seeds of doubt Silas was planting were falling on fertile ground. "I don't know," Silas said, playing his part to perfection. "He's a good tracker, but he's not one of us. We can't afford to trust our lives and our future to a man who won't even share a drink with us." He let the thought hang in the air, then he delivered the solution. "We need an insurance policy. We need to know where we're going without him. The next town is a place called Agua Fria. There's an old prospector there who knows these mountains better than anyone. I'll ride ahead, alone. I'll find him, get a map, some fresh supplies. You 3 stay with Cain. Keep him on the trail. I'll meet you in 2 days at the rendezvous point, the old mission at Tres Hermanas." It was a plausible plan, a leader's responsible action. Gideon, ever loyal, grunted his assent. Sundance and Dutch, their paranoia now fully engaged, agreed immediately. The idea of having a map, of not being completely dependent on the silent, rooting tracker, was a comforting one. They had no idea that they were being played. There was no old prospector in Agua Fria. Silas's plan was far more sinister. Silas rode off, and the 4 remaining men continued their journey. The atmosphere was now thick with a tense, open hostility. Sundance, Dutch, and Gideon rode together, casting dark, suspicious glances at Cain, who rode alone a few dozen yards ahead, seemingly oblivious to their plotting. That afternoon, Cain led them into a narrow, winding canyon. "Shortcut," he said, his voice a flat, unadorned statement. Sundance and Dutch exchanged a nervous look. Silas said he was taking us the long way round, Dutch whispered. "This is it. This is the trap." They rode into the canyon, their hands on their guns, their bodies cold with tension. The canyon walls rose high on either side, the trail a claustrophobic, shadowy path. Every rock looked like an ambush point. At the deepest, narrowest part of the canyon, Dutch's nerve finally broke. "I don't like this," he shouted, pulling his horse to a halt. "I'm not going any further." He pulled a stick of dynamite from his saddlebag, his movements jerky and erratic. "We're turning back." Cain stopped his horse and turned in his saddle, his face, for the first time, showing a flicker of something other than indifference. It was annoyance. "Put that away, you fool," he said, his voice a low growl. "You'll bring the whole wall down on us." But Dutch was beyond reason. He lit the fuse, his eyes wide with a crazed paranoia. "I said we're turning back." What happened next was a blur of motion. Cain did not go for his gun. He spurred his horse forward, not at Dutch, but past him. At the same moment, Sundance, believing this was the trap being sprung, drew his own Colt and fired at Cain. The shot missed, the bullet ricocheting off the canyon wall with a high, angry whine. The sound, in the enclosed space, was deafening. And it was the last thing that was needed to push the situation into utter, irreversible chaos. The explosion was immense. Dutch, in his panic, had dropped the lit stick of dynamite. The blast tore through the narrow canyon, a concussive wave of sound and force. The canyon walls, already unstable, shuddered. A low, grinding groan echoed from above, and then the world seemed to dissolve into a roaring, tumbling avalanche of rock and dust. Gideon, who had been at the rear, managed to wheel his horse and escape the worst of the rock slide, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. Sundance, closer to the blast, was thrown from his horse, his leg crushed by a falling boulder. Dutch, the architect of the disaster, was simply gone, buried under tons of rock, a victim of his own panicked fear. And Cain. Cain had made it through. His horse was bleeding from a dozen cuts, but he was on the far side of the rock slide, which had now completely and permanently sealed the canyon. He sat on his horse, looking back at the devastation, at the two men trapped on the other side, his face an unreadable, stony mask. From a high ridge, a mile away, Silas Thorne watched the distant plume of dust rise from the canyon through his field glasses. A slow, cold, and satisfied smile spread across his face. His plan had worked, with a brutal efficiency that had exceeded even his own expectations. He had not needed a fictional prospector. He had only needed to whisper a few words of poison, and let the inherent instability of his own men, and the unforgiving nature of the desert, do the rest. The Blackwater 5 were now the Blackwater 3. The math was improving, and the desert had just claimed its first 2 shares. The aftermath of the explosion was a scene of hellish, dust-choked silence. Gideon, the giant, stood beside his trembling horse, staring at the massive wall of rock and debris that had, in a single, thunderous moment, sealed the canyon. On the ground near him, Sundance was groaning, his face a pale, sweaty mask of agony, his leg trapped and horribly mangled beneath a heavy boulder. Dutch was gone, a part of the mountain now. And Cain. Cain was on the other side, a distant, unreachable figure. For a moment, all Gideon could do was stare, his simple, loyal mind struggling to process the sheer, catastrophic finality of it all. The plan, the brotherhood, the gold. It had all just been buried under a mountain of rock. The sound of Sundance's pained whimpering finally broke through his shock. Gideon's instincts, the instincts of a man whose world was built on simple, physical problems, took over. He went to his partner, and with a guttural roar of pure, brute force, he began to heave at the boulder that was trapping Sundance's leg. It was a Herculean effort. The veins on his thick neck stood out like ropes, his muscles screaming in protest. But slowly, inch by painful inch, he moved the rock, freeing the younger man. Sundance's leg was a ruin. The bone was shattered, the flesh torn. He looked at it, and a wave of nausea and despair washed over him. He was a gunslinger, a man whose life depended on his speed, his grace, his agility. He was crippled. His career, his legend, was over. "We're dead," Sundance rasped, his voice a dry, broken thing. "We're trapped. We have no water. We're dead." "Not yet," Gideon grunted, his voice a low, stubborn rumble. He was a man of simple loyalties, and his loyalty now was to the man beside him, the last remnant of their shattered gang. He tore strips from his own shirt and fashioned a crude splint for Sundance's leg. He gave him the last of his water, and then he began the impossible task of finding a way out. For the rest of the day, he searched, a tireless, hulking figure scrambling over the rocks, looking for a path, a crack, any way through or over the massive rock slide. There was none. The canyon walls were sheer and crumbling. They were sealed in. As dusk began to fall, a new, more terrifying thought began to creep into their minds. Silas. He was due to meet them at the rendezvous point. When they didn't show, what would he do? Would he come looking for them? Or would he assume they were dead, and ride on, with his share and theirs? The desert night fell, bringing a deceptive coolness. But it also brought the predators. The lonely, chilling howl of a coyote echoed from the canyon rim, a sound that seemed to mock their predicament. Sundance, his body on fire with the pain of his leg and a growing fever, began to drift into a delirium. He rambled about the gold, about the women in San Francisco, about the legend he had wanted to be. He was a broken man, his vanity and his future shattered in a single, dusty moment. Gideon sat beside him, a shotgun across his lap, a silent, stoic guardian. He was not a man of complex thoughts, but as he sat there in the darkness, listening to Sundance's fevered whispers, a simple, profound, and deeply unsettling realization began to dawn on him. This was not an accident. He replayed the events in his mind. Silas, separating from the group. The whispers of Cain's betrayal. Dutch's sudden, insane panic. It was too neat. It was too perfect. It felt orchestrated. He remembered the look on Silas's face as he had laid out his plan to ride to Agua Fria. It had not been the look of a worried leader. It had been the look of a card player, holding a winning hand. The loyalty that had been the bedrock of Gideon's existence began to crack. He had followed Silas without question for years, believing him to be a brilliant, if ruthless, leader. But now, he saw a different picture. He saw a man who saw his own crew not as partners, but as pieces on a chessboard, to be sacrificed for a larger prize. He, Gideon, the loyal muscle, and Sundance, the vain gunslinger, they were just pawns. Expendable. The thought was a betrayal so profound it shook him to his very core. His entire world, his simple code of loyalty, was a lie. As the first, pale light of dawn began to seep into the canyon, Sundance fell silent, his fever finally breaking into a deep, exhausted sleep. Gideon stood up and looked at the wall of rock that was their prison. His face was a grim, hard mask. He would get Sundance out of here. He would survive. He did not know how, but he would. And then, he would find Silas Thorne. Not for the gold, not for the brotherhood, but for the simple, brutal, and deeply personal satisfaction of settling a debt. The fellowship of the Blackwater Five was dead. In its place, a new, more terrible fellowship had been born, the fellowship of the wounded and the betrayed. While Gideon and Sundance were trapped in their rocky tomb, Silas Thorne was enacting the next phase of his cold, mathematical plan. He had ridden to the rendezvous point, the crumbling adobe ruins of the old Dos Hermanos mission, and he had waited. He gave his trapped men a full day and a half, a plausible window for them to be delayed. When they did not appear, he put on a convincing show for the only audience he had himself. He paced, he cursed their incompetence, he feigned a leader's worried frustration. Then, with a sigh of pragmatic finality, he declared them dead, victims of the desert or their own foolishness. He was now the sole, legitimate heir to the fortunes of the Blackwater Three. But there was still one variable left on the board: Cain. The tracker had been on the other side of the rock slide. He was alive. He was smart. And he had 2 of the 5 shares of the gold. This was a problem that needed to be solved. Silas did not believe Cain had betrayed them. He knew he had orchestrated the betrayal himself. But he also knew that Cain was now a loose end, a powerful and unpredictable rival who had to be eliminated. He did not ride out to hunt him. That would be a fool's errand, trying to outtrack a master in his own element. Silas, the card player, knew that the best way to win was to make the other player come to you. He would stack the deck. He rode to the nearest town, a dusty, fly-blown settlement called Scorpion's Breath. It was a place known for its lack of questions and its abundance of men who would do anything for a price. He went to the saloon, took a private room, and began to put out the word. He did not ask for a hired gun. He told a story. He was a respectable businessman, he said, who had been leading a small party of investors through the desert when they were betrayed by their guide, a quiet, dangerous man who called himself Cain. This Cain, he said, had engineered an accident, killed his partners, and made off with a fortune in gold bullion. He then offered a reward, a staggering, life-altering reward for the capture, dead or alive, of the traitor, Cain. And he added one crucial detail to the description: Cain would be heading for the Mexican border, carrying 2 heavy saddlebags of pure, stolen gold. He had just painted a massive, golden target on Cain's back. Every bounty hunter, every desperate gunslinger, every greedy opportunist within a 100-mile radius would now be on the hunt. He had turned the entire desert into his personal posse. Cain, meanwhile, was a ghost in the wilderness. He had seen the rock slide, had understood the brutal, final separation it had caused. He did not know if it was an accident or a deliberate act of betrayal, and at that moment, he did not care. He was a pragmatist. The partnership was dissolved. He had his share, his promised share, and that of the dead man, Dutch. His only thought now was to disappear, to cross the border into Mexico and find a quiet place to enjoy his hard-earned fortune. But the desert, which had been his sanctuary, was now turning against him. He was a man who noticed things, and he began to notice the change. He saw the lone riders on the ridges, watching him. He saw the way the men in the remote cantinas would fall silent when he entered, their eyes lingering on his heavy saddlebags. He realized, with a cold, detached clarity, that he was being hunted. The news of the bounty had traveled on the wind, faster than any horse. The hunter had become the prey. The next 2 days were a running battle. Cain was a master of evasion, his skills pushed to their absolute limit. He doubled back on his tracks, he used the rocky terrain to hide his passage, he traveled at night. But for every 2 bounty hunters he outsmarted, a third would pick up his trail. He was forced into a fight at a place called Devil's Wash. 2 men, thinking they had him cornered, tried to ambush him. They were good, but Cain was better. The fight was short, brutal, and ended with 2 more bodies left to the desert sun. But Cain did not emerge unscathed. He took a bullet in his left arm, a clean through and through, but a wound that made him weaker, slower. He knew he could not win this war of attrition. He was 1 man against a territory of hungry wolves. And he knew who had 6 them on him. Silas. It was the only logical explanation. He now faced a choice. He could continue his desperate flight to the border, a wounded animal being run to the ground. Or he could do the one thing his hunter would never expect. He could stop running. He could become the hunter again. He changed direction. He was no longer heading south, for Mexico. He was heading back east, towards Scorpion's Breath. He was no longer trying to protect his gold. He was going to settle a debt. The game had changed. The serpent, Silas, had spun a web of lies and greed to trap his final rival. But the spider, Cain, had just turned around and was now crawling back up the silken thread, and he was coming with a venom all his own. Back in the canyon of their entombment, the world for Gideon and Sundance had been reduced to a primal, desperate struggle for survival. The first 2 days were a hell of thirst, heat, and the slow, agonizing march of a seemingly hopeless situation. Sundance's fever grew, his wounded leg a source of constant, delirious pain. Gideon, with the stubborn, relentless strength of an ox, spent every waking hour working at the rock slide, his bare hands wry and bleeding, trying to shift immovable. On the 3rd day, their luck, or a cruel twist of fate, changed. A freak desert thunderstorm, a sudden, violent downpour, rolled through the canyons. It was a brutal, miserable experience, but it was also a salvation. It refilled their canteens from the runoff, and it washed away some of the looser debris from the rock slide, revealing what had been hidden beneath. It was not a way out. It was a body. The body of Dutch, the explosives man, his form horribly twisted and broken. But strapped to his body, miraculously intact, was his heavy leather satchel. Gideon carried the body of his former comrade to a sheltered alcove. He did not know what he was looking for. But inside the satchel, amidst the coils of fuse and the blocks of blasting powder, he found it. A small, but intact, stick of dynamite that had somehow survived the blast. A new, terrible, and desperate hope was born. Gideon was a brawler, not a blaster. He had only a vague understanding of the dark art that had been Dutch's specialty. But desperation is a powerful teacher. He took the stick of dynamite, used a piece of fuse he cut from a larger coil, and set about trying to blast a way through their prison. His first attempt was nearly fatal. He used too short a fuse and was almost buried himself in the resulting, uncontrolled explosion. But it moved the rocks. It widened a crack. For the next day, he worked with a frantic, focused intensity. He became a student of destruction, learning through trial and error, using small, controlled blasts to chip away at the mountain, to turn the instrument of their imprisonment into the key to their freedom. On the 5th day, he made a breakthrough. A final, well-placed charge opened a hole, a narrow, treacherous crawl space through the heart of the rock slide, just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He half-carried, half-dragged the delirious, protesting Sundance through the narrow, dark passage. They emerged on the other side, blinking in the harsh sunlight, like two men resurrected from a grave of stone. They were alive. They were free. But they were not the same men who had entered the canyon. The experience had stripped them down to their essential, Primal cores. Sundance, the vain gunslinger, was now a crippled, broken man, his pride shattered, his body a source of constant pain. His only remaining fuel was a bitter, all-consuming hatred for the man who had left him to die. And Gideon. Gideon, the simple, loyal giant, was gone. The man who emerged from that hole was something new. The betrayal had shattered his simple code, and in the void, something harder and colder had taken root. His loyalty had been a chain, and Silas had broken it. Now, Gideon was untethered, a force of pure, elemental rage. They found their horses, which had scattered but had not gone far, drawn by the scent of the recent rain. And they found the 2 saddlebags of gold that had belonged to Sundance and Dutch. "We take it," Sundance rasped, his eyes gleaming with a feverish, greedy light. "It's ours now. We take it, and we disappear." "No," Gideon said, his voice a low, final rumble. He looked at the heavy bags of gold with a look of utter contempt. "He left us to die for this. This is not the prize." He took one of the heavy bags, slit it open with his knife, and poured a river of golden coins and dust onto the desert floor, a glittering, meaningless sacrifice to the sun. "We are not going to run," Gideon stated, his eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, toward Scorpion's breath. "We are going to find him, and I am going to get my payment." He hoisted Sundance onto his horse, and they began their own slow and agonizing journey. They were no longer outlaws seeking a fortune. They were 2 wounded, resurrected ghosts, driven by the purest and most powerful of all frontier motivations, not greed, but revenge. The board was now set for a final, terrible reunion. The town of Scorpion's Breath was an ugly place for an ugly business. It was a festering sore on the face of the desert, a town where the currency was desperation, and the only law was the one a man could enforce with the gun on his hip. And for the last week, it had been the epicenter of a confluence of hate, the gathering point for 3 separate, but intertwined, currents of vengeance. Silas Thorne had made the town his temporary throne room. He had taken over the private, upstairs suite of the town's only 2-story building, the Black Scorpion Saloon. From his balcony, he could watch the comings and goings of the entire, miserable town. He had set his web, and now he was waiting, with a patient, reptilian stillness, for one of his flies to blunder into it. He had sent out 12 bounty hunters, and he was confident that one of them would eventually bring him the news of Cain's death. He drank fine whiskey, played cards with the sycophantic town boss, and enjoyed the feeling of being a king. But beneath the surface, a low-grade anxiety was beginning to simmer. Cain was too good, too quiet. The silence from the desert was becoming unnerving. Cain, the ghost, was the first to arrive. He did not ride into town. He slipped in on foot, in the dead of night, a phantom moving through the dark, filthy alleys. His arm was a source of constant, throbbing pain, but his mind was a blade of cold, clear focus. He was no longer the hunted, he was the assassin. He spent 2 days in the shadows, observing, gathering intelligence. He learned where Silas was staying. He mapped out the saloon, the position of the guards Silas had hired, the rhythms of the town. He was a patient, methodical predator, preparing for a single, final strike. On the 3rd day, 2 new figures appeared on the horizon. They were a pathetic sight, 2 wounded, ragged men on 2 exhausted horses. One man was a giant, his face a mask of grim, hard-bitten resolve. The other was slumped in his saddle, his leg crudely splinted, his face pale with fever and pain. It was Gideon and Sundance. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. The men in Scorpion's Breath were connoisseurs of human misery, and this was a prime example. They watched with a detached, vulture-like curiosity as the 2 men dismounted, the giant half carrying his crippled companion into the dusty, run-down hotel across the street from the Black Scorpion Saloon. From his balcony, Silas Thorne watched them arrive, and the whiskey glass in his hand trembled slightly. His face, for the first time in a week, lost its look of smut control and was replaced by one of utter, shocked disbelief. Ghosts. He had left them for dead, buried under a mountain. It was impossible. Yet, there they were. His mind reeled. The carefully constructed world of his own deceptions was collapsing. The pawns he had sacrificed had just crawled back onto the board, and they were no longer pawns. The look on Gideon's face, even from a distance, was not that of a subordinate. It was the look of a judgment. The situation had just spun completely, catastrophically, out of his control. He was now trapped. He had a ghost hunting him from the shadows, Cain, and two resurrected demons who had just walked in through his front door. The town of Scorpion's Breath, already a powder keg of greed and violence, was now the stage for a final, terrible reunion. The three remaining members of the Blackwater Five were now in the same place, at the same time, each of them driven by a singular, all-consuming motive, to kill the other two. Cain, from his hiding place in a hayloft overlooking the street, saw Gideon and Sundance arrive. He did not see them as allies. He saw them as complications, more variables in an already deadly equation. He had come here for Silas. Now, the board was crowded. Gideon, after getting Sundance a room and a bottle of laudanum for the pain, stood at the window of the hotel, staring across at the Black Scorpion Saloon. He could feel Silas's presence, a palpable thing, an itch under his skin. His simple, direct mind had only one thought: to cross that street, to go up those stairs, and to wrap his hands around the throat of the man who had betrayed him. And Silas, the master manipulator, the man who had always been 3 moves ahead, was now hopelessly trapped. He was surrounded. His web had not just caught his intended prey, it had caught him as well. The sun began to set on Scorpion's Breath, the light turning the dust in the street the color of old blood. The final, bloody chapter of the Blackwater Five was about to be written. The setting sun acted as a silent, final starting pistol. The fragile, tense piece of Scorpion's Breath was about to be shattered. The final act began not with a grand confrontation, but with a simple, brutal act of attrition. Cain, the patient spider, made the first move. He had observed the patterns of Silas's hired guards. 2 of them were stationed on the roof of the saloon, a pair of overconfident snipers who spent more time drinking than watching. From his hayloft, 100 yards away, Cain was a master of the patient, single shot. He took his time, waiting for the moment when the 2 guards were silhouetted against the last, fiery glow of the sunset. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one, echoed through the town. 2 bodies crumpled on the saloon roof. The eyes of the serpent had just been blinded. Inside the saloon, the 2 shots sent a jolt of panic through Silas. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it was Cain. The ghost had begun his hunt. At the same moment, across the street, the sound of the rifle shots was a catalyst for Gideon. He was not a man for subtlety or waiting. He had seen the 2 guards on the roof fall. He knew the time for waiting was over. He left Sundance, now passed out from the laudanum, in the hotel room, and descended the stairs, a shotgun in one hand and a heavy, long-barreled dragoon revolver in the other. He was a walking mountain of pure, unadulterated rage. He kicked the hotel doors open and strode out into the street. He was a massive, undeniable target. The remaining 2 guards Silas had posted at the saloon's entrance, their nerves already frayed, opened fire. Gideon did not flinch. He did not take cover. He walked forward into the hail of bullets, a man who had already died once and had nothing left to fear. A bullet tore through his arm, another grazed his side, but he kept coming, his face a mask of terrible, inhuman resolve. He raised the shotgun and fired both barrels. The blast was a thunderous roar that shattered the saloon's swinging doors and sent both guards flying backward, their bodies torn apart by the buckshot. The street was now clear. Gideon stomped across the dusty ground, a trail of his own blood marking his passage, and entered the saloon. Inside, Silas was a cornered rat. He heard the shotgun blast, heard the screams of his last guards. He knew Gideon was coming for him. He grabbed the last of his gold, a single, heavy saddlebag, and made a dash for the back stairs, his mind set on a single goal: escape. The saloon itself was a scene of chaos. The patrons, a collection of drunks and gamblers, were screaming, diving under tables, their petty squabbles forgotten in the face of a true, elemental violence. Gideon did not even glance at them. His eyes were fixed on the stairs at the back of the room. He saw a flicker of movement at the top. It was Silas. Thorne, Gideon's voice was a roar of pure, primal fury that shook the very bottles on the shelves. He raised his dragoon and fired, the heavy slug splintering the banister where Silas's head had been a second before. The final chase had begun. Gideon thundered up the stairs, his heavy boots shaking the entire structure. Silas, his face pale with a fear he had never known, scrambled down a back hallway, heading for a rear exit that led to the stables. But he was not the only hunter in the building. Cain, having seen Gideon begin his frontal assault, had slipped from his hayloft and entered the saloon from a side window, a silent, deadly phantom in the chaos. He knew where Silas would run, and he was waiting. As Silas burst out of the back door of the saloon and into the dark, narrow alleyway that led to the stables, he ran directly into Cain. The two men, the serpent and the spider, the two architects of the gang's destruction, finally stood face to face. Cain, Silas breathed, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around for an escape route that wasn't there. Silas, Cain replied, his voice a low, dead calm. He held a revolver in his hand, its aim unwavering. The bounty on my head. A bad calculation. We could have split it all, Silas said, his mind still working, still trying to find an angle. Just you and me. We still can. No, Cain said. Your math is flawed. There is only one share. From the doorway behind Silas, the massive, blood-soaked form of Gideon appeared. He blocked out the light from the saloon, his shotgun held at his side, his face a mask of terrible, final judgment. Silas was trapped. The two men he had betrayed, the two forces of nature he had unleashed, had him cornered. He did the only thing a cornered serpent can do. He hissed, and he struck. He dropped the bag of gold and drew his own gun, trying to take one of them with him. The alleyway erupted in a final, deafening symphony of gunfire. Cain's revolver, Gideon's shotgun, Silas's own pistol, all firing at once. When the smoke cleared, all three men were down. Silas was dead before he hit the ground, his body nearly torn in half. Gideon was slumped against the wall, a fatal wound in his chest, a look of grim, final satisfaction on his face. And Cain lay on his side, a dark, fretting stain on his shirt, his own life bleeding out into the filthy, dusty alley. The Blackwater Five were no more. The gold, the prize they had all killed for, lay spilled in the dirt, its yellow gleam a final, mocking testament to the futility of their greed. The silence that descended upon the alley behind the Black Scorpion saloon was a profound and final one. The symphony of gunfire had reached its crashing, bloody crescendo, leaving behind only the quiet, rustling sound of the desert wind and the soft, rhythmic dripping of blood into the dust. The gold, a river of coins and fine, yellow powder, lay scattered in the dirt, glowing with a soft, obscene light in the moonbeams that pierced the narrow alley. It was the prize, the sun around which all these violent planets had orbited, and now it was just so much meaningless, glittering dirt. Silas Thorne was dead, his body a broken testament to his own failed machinations. Gideon, the loyal giant, was also gone, his final, vengeful purpose fulfilled, his massive frame slumped against the wall, a statue of brutal, satisfied finality. But one man was still breathing. Cain lay on his side, the world a blurry, swimming haze. A fire was burning in his gut, a deep, internal heat that was slowly, inexorably, consuming him. He had been shot, badly. Silas's final, desperate shot had found its mark. He pushed himself up, his movements slow, agonizing. He leaned against the rough adobe wall, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked at the carnage around him. He looked at the bodies of his former partners, men he had both relied on and despised. He looked at the spilled gold. And he felt nothing. No triumph. No remorse. Only a cold, detached sense of a final, bloody equation having been solved. He was the last man standing. He had won. The prize was his. All of it. With a grunt of pure, animalistic will, he began to crawl. He ignored the bodies. He crawled towards the gold. His hands, slick with his own blood, scrabbled in the dirt, gathering the coins, scooping the dust, stuffing it all back into the heavy leather saddlebag. It was a slow, tortuous process. Every movement was an agony. But the instinct, the driving force that had kept him alive in the desert, the force that had made him the ultimate survivor, would not let him quit. After what seemed like an eternity, he had done it. The bag was full, heavy, a fortune that had cost the lives of 4 men. He tried to stand, to lift the bag, but his legs would not obey. The fire in his gut was spreading, a cold numbness beginning to creep into his limbs. He knew, with the detached, pragmatic certainty of a man who had seen death 1,000 times, that he was dying. He had won the game, but he would not live to collect the prize. A sound, a low, rattling noise, escaped his lips. It was a laugh. A dry, bitter, and utterly mirthless laugh. The irony was so perfect, so complete, that it was almost beautiful. He, Cain, the ultimate survivor, the man who had outthought the schemer and outfought the brutes, had been defeated in the end by a single, random piece of lead. He slumped back against the wall, the heavy bag of gold in his lap, a king on a throne of dust and blood, his kingdom an empty alley. He looked up at the night sky. The stars, which had been his map, his companions, his only constant in a life of shifting allegiances, seemed cold and distant. His life flashed before him, not as a series of memories, but as a long, lonely trail of dust, leading from nowhere to this exact, final spot. He had been a man with no name, no past, no connection. He had lived by a simple, brutal code: survive. And he had, until now. His breathing grew shallower. The cold was spreading, a final, peaceful winter. His hand, which had been clutching the bag of gold, loosened its grip. A few coins spilled out, landing in the dust with a soft, final clink. He was the last of the Blackwater Five. He was the sole inheritor of their bloody fortune. And he died there, alone, in a filthy alley in a town called Scorpion's Breath, with a king's ransom in his lap and a universe of emptiness in his soul. The sun rose on Scorpion's Breath, its light a harsh and forgiving judgment on the events of the night. It found the town in a state of shock, the citizens emerging from their homes like prairie dogs from a burrow after a storm has passed. They found the bodies, the shattered saloon doors, the river of spilled gold in the alley. The story they pieced together was a simple one, a tale as old as the hills. A band of outlaws, flush with a big score, had finally turned on each other, their greed a self-consuming fire. It was a common enough story on the frontier. The town boss, a man whose only real skill was survival, declared the gold the property of the town, a salvage fee for the damages incurred. The bodies were dragged to a mass and marked grave on the edge of town, a place they called Boot Hill, where the forgotten and the unmourned were left to the coyotes and the sun. The legend of the Blackwater Five, which had burned so brightly and so briefly, was extinguished, its members now just anonymous corpses in a nameless grave. Their story became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of the ultimate futility of a life built on greed and betrayal. And the desert. The desert was the only true winner. It had claimed them all, in its own way. It had broken them with its heat and its thirst. It had used its own unforgiving terrain to entomb them. And in the end, it had swallowed their bodies and their stories, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes. They say that 4 years after, travelers crossing the Great Mojave would sometimes find a strange glint in the sand. A single, forgotten gold coin, half buried in the dust, a piece of the desert's share of the Blackwater gold. And they say that if you camp in the canyons near the old Hermana's mission on a quiet night, when the wind is just right, you can almost hear the faint, ghostly echo of men arguing. Their voices full of suspicion and greed. It is the sound of the bargain being broken, over and over, for all eternity. The gold was gone, bent on a new saloon front and a new sheriff. The men were gone, their bones turning to dust in the hard, dry earth. All that was left was the vast, silent, and ever-patient desert. It had been there long before them, and it would be there long after, a silent, final graveyard for the dreams of violent men. It had taken its share, as it always does. For in the end, the desert always wins.